All right, let's dive right into this explainer and completely shatter the illusion that biological warfare is some modern invention cooked up in a sterile laboratory. When we hear terms like biological or chemical warfare, it's incredibly easy for our minds to immediately jump to the horrors of the 20th century, right? We picture the muddy trenches of World War I, choked with chlorine gas, or scientists in full hazmat suits working in top-secret Cold War facilities. But here's the truth. The weaponization of biology is not a modern innovation at all. It's actually ancient. It is quite literally written into the soil, the venoms, and the toxic plants used by our ancestors. It's fascinating to contrast our modern anxiety about high-tech warfare with the really gritty reality of ancient commanders. These tacticians were weaponizing biology thousands of years before the concept of germ theory even existed. They didn't have microscopes, they didn't have the vocabulary of cellular biology, and they definitely didn't understand pathogens on a microscopic level. But what they did have was a profound empirical understanding of nature's toxicity. Through pure trial and observation, they knew exactly what made water deadly, what caused a wound to fester uncontrollably, and precisely how to harness the invisible killers hiding right there in their own environment. It was literally an arms race of toxicological ingenuity long, long before modern science. Case Study 1, Scythicon, the toxic cocktail of the steppe. So to see just how advanced this empirical science really was, we have to travel back to the 4th century BC, out onto the harsh, windswept plains of the Eurasian steppe. Here we find the Scythians. These guys were a loose confederation of nomadic pastoralists and absolute masters of horse archery. But they were feared across the ancient world for so much more than just their mobility. They crafted a terrifying biological weapon known as Scythicon, and this was specifically designed to guarantee that even a minor, non-fatal scratch from an arrow would result in a horrifyingly slow death. First, they extracted the venom of local vipers, but venom alone dries out and loses its potency on long military campaigns, right? So to preserve it, they mixed it with human blood serum and putrefied animal dung or carrion, sealed it up tight in a container, and buried it. Now, from a modern biological perspective, what they were doing is actually brilliant in a dark way. They were creating the perfect oxygen-poor environment for pathogens to just explode and multiply. They were literally cultivating the bacteria behind tetanus and gas gangrene into this putrid, highly infectious sludge. And the effects were just devastatingly multi-layered. When a Scythian arrow pierced an enemy, it forced this deadly cocktail deep into the oxygen-deprived muscle tissue. If the initial hemotoxins from the viper venom didn't cause rapid tissue necrosis and systemic shock, killing the soldier within hours, well, the delayed effects from the deep tissue bacteria would absolutely take over. Within 24 to 48 hours, the victim would develop gas gangrene, where their limbs would literally swell up and turn black. Or they'd suffer from the tetanus neurotoxin, which causes uncontrollable muscle spasms, ultimately locking the jaw shut and leading to asphyxiation. They effectively turned a superficial scratch into a prolonged, agonizing ordeal. This dual threat is exactly why the famous Roman poet Ovid absolutely dreaded these arrows. While he was exiled near the Black Sea, he observed this terror firsthand. He recognized that the microscopic agents brought a devastating secondary attack. It wasn't just the physical puncture of the arrowhead that you had to be terrified of. It was the invisible, lingering death that always followed. He actually called it a double death, which perfectly captures the dual nature of this ancient biochemical strike. Okay, this is absolutely mind-blowing to me. Our everyday modern word toxic stems directly from the sheer terror inspired by these ancient nomadic archers. The Greek word toxicon literally translates to bow poison, referring explicitly to those tainted arrows of the Scythians. So every single time we use the word toxic today, whether we're talking about chemical spills or even bad relationships, we are directly echoing the ancient dread of a Eurasian biological weapon. Moving on to case study 2, weaponizing nature with botanical traps. So ancient tacticians eventually escalated things. They went from targeting individual soldiers to neutralizing entire populations just by using the environment itself. We're going to look at 2 legendary botanical traps here. The Athenian statesman Solon poisoning a city's water supply, and King Mithridates baiting Roman soldiers with hallucinogenic honey. Both of these tactics relied on a very deep understanding of local flora to completely incapacitate disciplined armies without drawing a single sword. Let's look closer at the siege of Kura first. Way back in the early 6th century BC, a Greek alliance was really struggling to break the formidable walls of the city of Kira. Realizing that a conventional victory was pretty much impossible, Solon decided to divert the city's water supply, the Pleistos River. His forces gathered massive quantities of a highly toxic local plant called black hellebore, crushed up the roots, and steeped them right into the diverted water. When they finally redirected that saturated water back into the thirsty city, the cardiac glycosides in the hellebore completely crippled the defending soldiers. It acts as a violent purgative. The citizens suffered from massive gastrointestinal illness, extreme dehydration, and severe muscle weakness. The guards literally couldn't even stand up to hold their shields. This allowed the attackers to just easily breach the walls and overrun the entire city. Now, flip forward centuries later to 65 BC, and King Mithridates VI of Pontus did something similar, but he manipulated his enemies' hunger instead of their thirst. He was being chased through the mountainous Black Sea coast by the legendary Roman general Pompey the Great. So Mithridates' allies deliberately left jars of fresh honey along the mountain passes for the Romans to find. But this wasn't regular honey. This was mad honey, or Delhi ball. The local bees had fed on wild rhododendrons, concentrating powerful neurotoxins right into the honey. On a biological level, these toxins attack the nervous system by locking open sodium ion channels. When the hungry Roman legionaries eagerly ate it up, it caused severe bradycardia, which is a dangerous slowing of the heart, huge drops in blood pressure, and deep, paralyzing hallucinogenic stupors. Because of this one brilliant ecological trap, roughly 1,000 elite, highly trained Roman soldiers basically fell into paralyzed, vomiting stupors right there on the forest floor. Once they were completely incapacitated, Mithridates' allies just swept down and slaughtered them without losing a single man of their own. It is a strategic masterclass in using local ecology as a weapon of war against an invading force that lacked environmental knowledge. Case Study 3, Live Ammo. Let's talk about the scorpion bombs of Hatra. Jumping forward again to 1980 AD, right into the blistering heat of Mesopotamia, we have to ask, how on earth do you break a massive Roman siege? When the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus marched his highly disciplined army against the wealthy desert fortress of Hatra, he brought massive siege towers, battering rams, and thousands of heavily armed legionaries. The defenders of Hatra were trapped behind their high stone walls. They had to figure out a way to repel literally the most organized and technologically advanced military force on Earth at that time. Their absolutely terrifying solution was to bypass conventional weapons entirely. Instead, they dropped fragile clay jars filled with highly venomous desert scorpions directly onto the packed Roman ranks below. In that intense desert heat, these scorpions, which were likely species like the deadly deathstalker, were incredibly active and absolutely furious. When those jars shattered against Roman armor or hit the hard ground, they released an onslaught of neurotoxins. From a biological standpoint, this venom blocks potassium and sodium channels, triggering intense burning physiological breakdowns, wild muscle spasms, respiratory distress, and eventually cardiac failure. But honestly, it wasn't just the venom that won the day, it was the psychological terror. Just imagine the absolute nightmare of angry, venomous scorpions trapped inside tight, segmented Roman armor, crawling down into boots and up under helmets. The sheer physical agony and blind panic forced the highly disciplined Romans to just drop their weapons and literally strip naked in the middle of a battle, just trying to get the stinging arachnids off their bodies. This completely broke their siege formations and left them highly vulnerable. The tactic was so relentlessly effective that it utterly shattered the morale of the legions and forced Emperor Severus into a full retreat. The fortress of Hatra remained unconquered. Case Study 4. Catapulting the Black Death at Kaffa in 1346. To see how these biological tactics bridged into the medieval era and quite literally altered global history, we looked at 1346. A Mongol army that was besieging the Genoese trading port of Kaffa was suddenly struck by a devastating outbreak of the bubonic plague within their own camp. Realizing his entire army was dying, the Mongol commander made a grim decision. He weaponized his own plague-ridden dead. He ordered the bloated, infected corpses to be loaded onto massive trebuchets and catapulted right over the city walls into the cramped, unsanitary streets of Kaffa. Now, at the time, people believed in the miasma theory, the idea that foul, bad air spread the disease. So while they didn't know the plague was actually being carried by fleas hosted on rats, their empirical tactic worked perfectly anyway. The catapulted corpses triggered a massive, localized outbreak in the city. Terrified Genoese merchants fled Kaffa on their ships, sailing back to the Mediterranean. And many historians believe these very ships carried the infected rats and fleas that ultimately introduced the Black Death to Europe, wiping out a huge percentage of the continent's population. It is just a chilling milestone of biological warfare altering the entire course of global history. Which brings us to the ancient rules of war and the ethics of this invisible battle. Now, ancient warfare wasn't entirely a lawless free-for-all. These horrifying capabilities actually forced early civilizations to stop and actively wrestle with the ethics of conflict. Commanders quickly realized that biological weapons were wildly unpredictable. Once you poisoned a river or unleashed an infected corpse or released a plague, you couldn't control it anymore. These weapons often backfired, devastating the user's own troops just as easily as the enemy. Furthermore, they fundamentally undermined the honor of hand-to-hand combat. Ancient cultures highly valued the warrior ethos, this deep idea of individual skill, bravery, and facing your opponent directly in battle. Biological warfare stripped all of that away, replacing valor with this invisible, creeping cowardice. Because of this, we see strict ethical lines being drawn over 2,000 years ago. In ancient India, the laws of Manu explicitly prohibited the use of biological tactics, clearly stating that a true warrior does not strike with concealed weapons or poisoned arrows. And we see similar rules popping up all across the ancient world. In Greece and Rome, there were deep, powerful cultural taboos explicitly forbidding the poisoning of wells, viewing it as a gross violation of the laws of nature and a direct affront to the gods themselves. So while today we heavily rely on modern international treaties, like the Biological Weapons Convention, to prevent the proliferation of these horrors, it is abundantly clear that the dark roots of biochemical warfare run deep into our collective history. The fundamental strategies and the psychological terror were all established thousands of years ago. It really makes you rethink what ancient warfare actually looked like, doesn't it? Think about all of it: the poisoned arrows, the hallucinogenic honey, the scorpion bombs, and the plague corpses. Out of all of this, what ancient weapons surprised you the most? Keep that thought with you, and until next time, keep exploring the hidden layers of our history.
Please like and subscribe.